and strength in numbers. And I like that saying. One, because it's from one of my favorite basketball teams. That's why Dabs is smiling up here, because he knows it's from the Golden State Warriors. But the whole meaning of the saying is their basketball team, there's individuals that are very talented. If you don't know basketball, there's players like Steph Curry and stuff like that. Really good. But the saying is more than that. Yes, we have all this individual talent, but when it comes together, it's even stronger. So what I'm trying to leave with y'all tonight is look who you surround yourself with. Look at the people you decide to spend your time with. Who's going to be there with you through the hard times? Who's going to be there with you through the good times? So what I want to start with tonight is, I want to start with a question. And I want to ask y'all, when you think of your best friend, when you think of the person who's closest to you in life, what are some of the qualities that come to your mind when you try to describe this person?
Dependable.
Dependable. What else?
Loyal.
Loyal.
Honest.
Honest.
Accountable.
Accountable. What else?
Loving.
Loving. Yeah. What else?
Prayerful.
What is it?
Prayerful.
Prayerful. I like that one. I really like that one. Any other ones? The scripture I kind of based tonight off of was Romans chapter 12. You know, I didn't think we got enough Romans in this semester, so I wanted to make sure we read it at least one more time before we leave. So, in Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 9, it reads, "Let love be genuine. Adore what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection, outdoing one another and showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, and bless and do not curse them." And then this is the verse I really want to harp on tonight. "Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep." Right here, it kind of sums up what it means to be Christians with one another. It starts out by talking about love. Let it be genuine. When we're talking about our relationships in the church, it should be genuine. It shouldn't be out of commands. It shouldn't be something that we feel like we have to do. But we should have a love for one another that we want to help each other. And when it comes to all these things, when it comes to being with one another, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And we read that, and I think we have an easy time with the rejoice with those who rejoice. I mean, when everything's good, when everybody's having a good time, everybody loves to join in. Everybody loves to hop on that train and have a good time with everybody else. But then we get into the idea of weep with those who weep. When you're going through a hard time, are your friends, are those people surrounding you weeping with you? Are they helping you through those tough times? Are they pushing you to be better, even when you're going through a tough time? And tonight I want to look at a couple of Old Testament examples of what it means to have this kind of friendship that pushes you to be better even when you're going through tough times. Who's going to be there with you even when it's not easy. So let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18. And for some reason, this has been coming up a lot in the last couple of weeks around school. I mean, at least 2 or 3 Bible studies I've been to, this relationship and this passages have come up. So I thought it was a good idea to bring it up tonight because it really shows what a true friendship looks like. So will someone read 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 5? Lofton, will you read that for me?
18, what?
1 through 5.
As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. So Saul sent him over the men of war, set him over the men of war, and this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants.
So we see here that, just a little context, David comes back from war, from fighting the Philistines, and David, being the great warrior he was, is killing a bunch of these men. And Saul sees this and he's like, all right, who is this? So he's like, he calls David into his chambers and he's like, who are you? Whose son are you? And so they have a conversation, and then it picks up in verse 18 that they finish this conversation. And something in this conversation piques the interest of Jonathan. So when they finished talking, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. What does that mean? What does it mean when your soul is knit to another person?
You feel attached to them.
Feel attached? What else?
When you're knit together, you become one. Basically, I mean, it's not like a marriage, but it's very similar to the relationship that you would have in a marriage, and that they're knit and that they've become one.
Yeah. All right, what else?
You love that person.
You love that person. Is it physical? Like, is it saying their souls were actually knit together? That's how close they were? Think about it like this. This is how I kind of thought about it when I was reading this. David is described as a man after God's own heart. That's not a physical thing. Because God doesn't have a physical heart that we have. It means that David's ways were exactly like God's. David's will lined up with God's. That's how they kind of shared this heart. So when it talks about their souls being knit together, it means that they were on such a deep level of relationship that everything they wanted was the same, especially their spiritual life. They saw God exactly the same. They saw it just as important to love and trust the Lord exactly the same. That's why Jonathan loved David. That's why David loved Jonathan. Because what they wanted, they had the same goal. And that was to serve the Lord. It was beyond this human level of friendship. It became something more than that. It became they had a common goal and they were going to accomplish it together. It becomes this inseparable devotion to one another. But even more important, it becomes an inseparable devotion to God. Like you see in the next few chapters that their friendship, everything is based on God. Every choice they make, every time they talk, God is involved. That's what our friendships should look like. Everything about our relationships in our life should be centered around God. When you have relationships that aren't centered around God, they become more meaningless. Because you don't have this common goal that you're striving for together. And then it says they made a covenant with one another. And after this covenant, Jonathan actually takes off his robe, takes off his armor, takes off all of his stuff, and gives it to David. And what's interesting is, one thing I read, I don't know this for sure, but it was just a cool tip that I read. But some people say that this is almost like Jonathan handing over his kingship to David. Like he was just accepting that David was going to be the next king. Because we see in other examples that giving someone your clothes, giving someone your armor, that was like a transfer of authority. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly what's going on in this case. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it's just a cool thing to think about, that Jonathan had no pride in this relationship. He didn't see David as a competitor. He didn't see him as a threat. He didn't see him as someone he needed to fight against. He saw someone that was chasing to do God's will, and he wanted to be with that person. He wanted to have a relationship with that person. So we see that David and Jonathan build this relationship, and it's so strong that when tough times come, they can handle that together. And we see that in 1 Samuel chapter 19. So if someone will read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 19.
And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand before my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, Let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul swore, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before.
All right, so here we see their friendship's put to the test now. I mean, it's easy to say back then, oh, let's make a covenant with each other. We love each other. Our souls are knit together. But now it's time to put that into action. Saul comes up to Jonathan and tells him about the plot to kill David. And Jonathan was not okay with this. Jonathan actually stands up to his father, and more importantly, the king. I mean, we can look at this as a father-son relationship, but if Saul wanted to, he could have just had Jonathan killed in that moment. Oh, you want to go up against me? Okay, you're dead. Jonathan was risking so much right here for David, because that's the kind of relationship they had. It even talks about, like, Jonathan knew that God had left his father. And that's why he related so much more with David, because he knew God was with David. He knew that's what God wanted, and if that's what God wanted, he was okay with that. So he was ready to fight his father, possibly die, for his friendship with David. And we learn that Jonathan later goes on to die. And everybody, it's kind of easy to look at this as a one-sided friendship, but it wasn't. Everybody sees Jonathan knitting himself to David, but you never see David knitting himself back. But that's not the case. And I think that's an important side to see. We read over and over again, they keep making this covenant. We read that in 18 and also again in 20. And the covenant was that David would take care of the descendants of Jonathan. So we see in 2 Samuel chapter 9, we see that happen. After Jonathan dies, David becomes king. David tracks down the one relative of Jonathan, his son. And what does he do? He restores his land. His son was actually crippled, by the way. Restores his land and gives him providence over it, fulfilling his covenant to Jonathan. So this wasn't a one-sided friendship. They loved each other, but more importantly, they strived to chase after God together. That's what made their relationship so strong. So I ask you, what are some things that we can see from David and Jonathan and their relationship? What can we apply to our lives today?
Relationships require sacrifice.
Yeah, they do. What else?
I think one of the things you see is that Jonathan and David have, and you said it a bunch of times, is that they have like mind. They have the same goals, and a similar like aspirations, and so it affects their friendship and their entire lives really. But you can certainly see that as the main like commonality in their friendship.
Mhm. I think it's interesting that he brings that up, that they had like minds. And one thing we see throughout Scripture when talking about the first century church is unity. Unity in mind, unity in actions, unity in all sense of what it means. Because that's what it means to be a part of the church. It means to have a relationship like this, that all of our goals, all of our aspirations, everything that we want, it should all be one thing. That's to get to heaven. That's how we are all knit together. That's how we all have a relationship like Jonathan and David. Because our goals are all the same. What we want is the same thing. And we should be striving to help each other get there. The other example I want to look at is the book of Ruth. We see that Jonathan and David get to build this relationship together, and then the tough times come. And because they've already established that relationship, they're able to endure it together. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we have people close to us that can help us. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes the people around us, our closest friends, don't understand the struggles we are going through in that moment. And that's okay. There's always going to be someone there that understands it. It just might mean building a new relationship. So let's see how Naomi and Ruth build a relationship through a tragic time. Someone read, Daddles, will you read 1 through 10?
Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, her and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the women survived her 2 sons and her husband. Is that through verse 10?
Yes.
Okay. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, Surely we will return with you to your people.
Ethan, will you read 11 through 18?
But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they are grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, For it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you, or to return from your following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more.
Alright, so you have the story of Naomi. And Naomi has it pretty rough. So her and her family go to a land to find wives for her sons. And they find two wives, Orpah and Ruth. And what happens is her husband dies, and then her two sons die. And in this time, in this day and age, for this to happen, not good. For all these women to be left without husbands is just a dire situation. So you have this situation where the two daughter-in-laws are basically looking at Naomi as like, what are we going to do? And Naomi's like, I ain't got any more sons for y'all. It's not good for y'all to be alone. Go find other husbands. Go back to your land. Go find new husbands. And Orpah, she's like, obviously they're not happy about it, but she's like, okay, I'll leave you. But then Ruth does the complete opposite. It says in verse 14 that Ruth clung to her. And this idea of cling to, it implies this firm loyalty, this deep affection to Naomi, that she just wants to be with her. I think it's interesting that this cling to is the same kind of language that we see when you're talking about something as strong as marriage. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say like they had a marital relationship, but the whole idea of a marriage is a covenant between two people. And you see that here. This idea of a covenant between these two people. You also see the same idea seen all throughout David and Jonathan's relationship. This covenant, this agreed upon relationship that they're going to be there for one another. So you see Ruth cling to her mother-in-law. She said, I'm going to be with you. She actually even puts terms on the covenant. You don't try to send me away. And then what is she going to do? Where you wait, nope, that's not it. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So you see here, Ruth rejects everything about her life. She rejects where she came from, her previous family, her previous people, her previous gods, everything. She rejects everything for Naomi. Because she had such a strong relationship to Naomi. So Naomi takes her back. And I think, I love the story of Ruth. Because of this, Ruth becomes one of the few, I think, 3 women in the genealogy of Jesus. And Ruth is one of them. A Moabite woman who would not give up on this relationship because she loved her mother-in-law so much. That's the kind of relationship that we should have for one another. That we're willing to reject everything for one another. Our worldly lives, even sometimes family. That's what we're willing to reject for our church family, for those closest to us. So what are things we can learn from this relationship between Ruth and Naomi?
I just keep going back to Proverbs 18:24. that there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And I think it's that same kind of relationship that it really just can't be undone once you're into it.
Yeah.
Like, you're just kind of stuck with that person, and you love them no matter what.
Mm-hmm. What else?
All of that, including that verse, makes me think of just loyalty, loyalty to each other and to God, and to have that
Yeah.
between them.
What else?
I think it also shows like doing more than just what your words say, because if you look at it, the other daughter-in-law was like, yeah, I'll stay too. And then after Naomi was like, yeah, just go, then she left still. Ruth like held on to her word. She said, yeah, I'll stay, and she actually stayed.
Mm-hmm. She kind of doubled down on it. She's like, I said I'm staying, I'm staying. I think so too. And you see this, this is just a tragic situation that bonded these two people together. I mean, I'm not saying you can't have a close relationship with your in-laws, but it's usually not this tight. But because they both experienced this tragedy together, I think it binds them so much stronger than anything else. And you see this when you realize that people are going through the same struggles as you. It makes you your friendship, your walk with Christ, all of it. It makes it so much stronger because you know the person right beside you is struggling just like you are. So we've talked a lot about the Old Testament. What are some New Testament ideas? What are some verses, some passages that we can see this applied, maybe with people, or more importantly, the church?
Jesus and James, Peter, and John.
All right.
Just his closeness with those three apostles. Even within his 12, he had people that he was closer with.
Yeah. Even within those four, he had one that one assumed he was closer with at least. John called himself the one Jesus loved. So something tells me their relationship was pretty strong if he felt that way about himself. Or he was just arrogant, one or the other. What else?
When Lazarus died and Jesus wept.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can assume Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus, but he still wept for his friend. What else?
Acts 4:32, it says, now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of these things he possessed was his own, but they all had all things in common.
Yeah. I think you kind of see the same idea in Acts 2. When the churches just get started, like you see all these people buying, or not buying, but selling their possessions and providing for one another because that's how much they cared for one another. It talks about there wasn't a need that wasn't met in the first century church. What's another passage that comes to y'all's minds?
I think about Philippians 2.
Yeah.
The part of the reason Paul writes Philippians is the two women in the church are mad about something, mad at each other, and I don't know if that's exactly why he talks about this in chapter 2, but it makes you think maybe there's part of that reason, because in chapter 2 the whole chapter is really do nothing from selfish, like verse 3, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. And then uses Jesus as the ultimate example, saying have this attitude in yourselves, which is also in I mean, the whole chapter though is just about, putting other people above yourself, not grumbling or complaining about one another, because that makes you look bad, but instead, like, hold fast to God as a body, as everyone. And then when you do that, and you're willing to, like in verse 17, he's, like Paul says, like with his ministry, he's being poured out as a drink offering upon, the sacrifice and service of your faith. And so he's kind of saying, like, my whole ministry, like, I'm kind of pouring everything out for you, and the expectation is kind of, well, in verse 18, you too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way, share your joy with me, but the idea is kind of like work also, like, complete his joy, and like what he says, complete his joy in verse 2 is make my joy complete by being of the same mind. And so, to rejoice and to share in that same joy as Paul in Philippians 2 is to be of the same mind and put other people above yourself. So I think that's a good representation of the New Testament.
Yeah, I agree. The last passage I want to look at, since we're running out of time, is 1 Peter chapter 5. And this passage came up probably about 6 months ago, and ever since then it's stuck with me. It's become one of my favorite passages. I probably talk about it all the time. If you've ever heard me speak at anything, I probably brought up this verse because I think it's just super impactful for us. So 1 Peter chapter 5, starting in verse 6, it says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. Cast all of your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kind of sufferings are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever." And if you know the context of 1 Peter, he's writing to all these Christians that are facing such horrible persecution. Rome is just barreling down on the church at this time. But he says to them, after talking about the devil coming after them, he says, "Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kind of sufferings are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world." The whole idea I want to convey tonight, and I hope that you take with you, is that you're not alone. We've talked a lot about building these relationships, but it's not just about having these relationships and not doing anything with them. It's about having these relationships so that when you're going through a tough time, or you're struggling with some kind of sin, you realize that there's someone right there beside you who's either probably struggling with you or is there to pick you up. That's the whole purpose of the church. God never wanted us to go through this life, through this Christian walk alone. I promise you will never see that idea anywhere in the Bible. He gave us the church. And we've talked a lot in one of our classes about how scared we are to talk about certain topics because we're just uncomfortable about it, or we don't think people understand. I promise you people understand. I promise you we're all facing the same, maybe not the same exact things, but we're all struggling. Look around, there's not a single perfect person in here. There's probably not a single person who doesn't go throughout a day without sinning. But we like to bottle that in because we think we're the only ones. We like to show up to church and put on this facade that we're this perfect person when we're not. When we're really just broken and we all need Christ. I really appreciate your time, and we have Devo after this, but I hope y'all remember that there's people here who want to help you. Whether it's the people in the back who have a little more knowledge, or it might be the person sitting to your right or left. There's someone who wants to help you through the struggles. You just have to be willing to ask. Thank you.
The bell rang, but it started heating up for real, right?
I'm gonna start flying.
Good job, Bill.